All right, so this is a short demo or tutorial on the new bill of materials functionality for the network design apps. And previously, what we could do is we could model supply chains from suppliers through to customers, but we had to express all those flows in terms of the final product, the finished good. For example, in this supply chain over here, if you look at a supply chain for solar panels, you can see the outbound flows from factories and DCs and local DCs to customers. What you've got the ability to do now with bill of materials is to also see the raw material flows. In this demo, we've configured 5 raw materials. You can see here that those raw materials flow from suppliers that make those raw materials into production facilities, and then at those production facilities, those raw materials are combined into finished products. So in this case, raw material 1, 2, 3, and 4 and 5 are combined into solar panels, and those are either thin film, mono, or poly. So how do we do that? So if you look at the data template, what you've got is a supply chain as we had it. But what we've done now is in our suppliers, instead of just configuring suppliers for final products, which we've got here as well, these suppliers making mono, poly, and thin film panels, but we've also got the supplier of these raw materials that we saw in the screen. So raw materials 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 made at these various raw material suppliers. And then what we give the app information about is how are those raw materials combined into final product. So for example, in the monobomb bill of needs, we're telling it that to make one monocrystalline panel, you need 1 unit of raw material 1, 1 unit of raw material 2, and 1 unit of raw material 3, etc. And you can also say where those conversions take place. So for example, in this one, we've called it location prod. That's actually these 4 suppliers here. So we're representing these as our own manufacturing facilities, which convert raw materials into final product. And then, of course, at those production facilities, the conversion activity consumes capacity and it occurs at a cost. And then we can also go ahead and specify the different suppliers, which we mentioned already. And we also specify the capacity that conversion operation takes at each of the production facilities. So that's one example of a solar panel manufacturer making panels out of raw materials. Another good example is if you're in the fuel industry and you want to model crude oil coming into a refinery, and that crude oil is converted into diesel and gasoline. So for example, in this bill of materials, we're saying 1 barrel of crude oil, which is equivalent to 0.15 cubic meters, is converted into 0.06 cubic meters of refined diesel and 0.06 cubic meters of refined gasoline. So there's a yield loss there as well. We're using different units of measure to configure this bill of material. So that's just another example of a use case. So let's see how that looks in the app. We've already seen a little bit of this, but what you've got the ability now to do is say, well, let's take a look at our flows for inbound raw materials. So there you can see again that raw material flow from the raw material suppliers into the production facility that we've configured, and then the production conversion happens at that production facility. You can start picking up the cost of that production conversion activity. And of course, you can also look at your other flows. So these are finished goods that we buy from suppliers. You've got then the rest of the supply chain from your central DCs out to the local DCs, your inter-resource transport, and your secondary distribution outbound of final products. So what you've got now is end-to-end supply chain from raw material supplier through a production facility where it's converted into another product and then distributed outbound to satisfy your demand. That's just a view of the supply chain, and if we look at some of the other results, how that looks. So this is the summary of that production conversion activity. So at these different suppliers on the map, St. Wendell, for example, Over here is the production activity of St. Wendell, where it's producing these final products, so mono, poly, and thin film panels. But out of those raw materials that we specify, you can also see your suppliers pulling through. So this is the supplier graph. So now instead of just suppliers of finished goods, for example, we're still buying some finished panels from Krems, but we're also buying those raw materials from the different raw material suppliers. And this tells us exactly how much raw material we need for those different conversion activities. We can start picking it up in the cost as well. So if you look at the end-to-end cost statement, you can start seeing the production variable costs coming into the equation, and the end-to-end supply chain costs. So here's those 4 factories, our production facilities. And then these are the volumes and the associated production costs for doing that conversion activity. And you can also start seeing that in the cost to serve report. So previously we only had the DC fixed and variables and the transport and the supply cost. If you look at these customers to serve, you can see still those supply costs. This then would include the cost of raw material supply. And then one of the cost elements will be the production variable cost that it incurred, not at final destination, but at the production location where that cost was incurred. That's a summary of how you now model from raw materials through production and conversion, and you can also model intermediate products through to final products, and then outbound into the supply chain. So proper end-to-end supply chain modeling.